Hello, my name is Mir John, and welcome to a bedtime story for grown-ups of every age. This tale is crafted to calm your spirit and guide you into a deep, peaceful sleep. As you listen, just let your heart open wide. Let your body grow heavy and soft. Allow your mind to wander alongside the traveler in our story. So, before we start, take a gentle breath in and a slow breath out. Find a comfortable position and let your body grow still, moving only with the quiet rhythm of your breathing. And now let us begin. Our traveler, Elias, jolted awake. His head had fallen back against the train window, and he had almost drifted off. He looked around and saw he wasn't the only one. Other early morning commuters were also stealing a few last moments of rest before their day began. No one else seemed to have stirred. Just a sleepy twitch, he thought to himself. Maybe I wasn't really asleep at all. Elias had a long daily journey. He lived in a small apartment at the very end of the subway line. Even though the trip was lengthy, he was always thankful to find a seat. He made sure to be one of the first on the train. The travel time is worth it for a comfortable ride, he would tell himself. He thought about his destination. Elias was a project lead for a respected tech company in the city. He had been there for almost a decade, starting right after he finished his studies. He liked his co-workers and had a good relationship with his manager, Clara, but each time he thought about walking into the office, a small, tight feeling would form in his stomach. He noticed the feeling come and he watched it go, but he never forgot that something felt out of place. He arrived at work and greeted the others who had also come in early. He liked to start his day as soon as possible so he could finish early and enjoy the evening light in the city's many parks. His fingers began their work, typing away on projects and writing to clients. Sometimes in the afternoon, when the office was quiet, he would take a break from his screen. He would look up places he dreamed of visiting one day: Japan, New Zealand, Brazil, Italy. But on this particular morning, he was focused, busy with a new project for a startup based in Rome. As he typed, his manager, Clara, gently interrupted him. "Elias," she said, "I've been thinking. I'd really like for us to build a stronger connection with the team in Rome. I want to send you there to meet our clients, to put a face to our name. There's real potential for a long partnership here." For the first time in a long, long time, Elias felt a spark of joy. A smile spread across his face. Clara took this as a yes. "I'd love to," he said. The plan was for him to spend 5 days in the city, with time for both work and exploration. Elias's mother was Italian. She had grown up just outside of Rome before moving to another country when she was young. Elias himself had never been, but he had always felt a deep, quiet pull toward the land of his ancestors. Life just got in the way, he thought, though he knew that was no real excuse. That night, Elias went home and started packing immediately. He wasn't leaving until the end of the week, but he couldn't contain his excitement. He called his parents to tell them the news, and they were thrilled. He went to bed that night, looking out his window at the stars. The moon was nearly full, lighting up the world below. He watched planes, like tiny drifting lights, cross the night sky. Soon, he thought, I'll be up there. He hadn't flown since he was a boy, and he was now nearing 30. Memories began to surface. He thought of his childhood and his strong bond with his grandparents. His grandfather had owned a small orchard. Elias remembered walking with him through the rows of trees and into the nearby woods to look for wild mushrooms. Those walks always felt magical. Maybe it was the way the light fell through the leaves, or the sound of the birds, or the smell of the damp earth. It was probably all of it together. He remembered his grandmother vividly, her cooking, her laughter. She was wonderfully kind and always asked for help in the kitchen. He and his sister would wash the vegetables and help stir the simmering pots of sauce. It had been years since Elias had cooked a proper meal, a realization that stirred something in him. He missed it. He missed the slow, gentle pace of those evenings. It's been far too long, he thought. In that moment, he made a promise to himself to find his way back to the kitchen after his trip. The week passed slowly, but finally, the day of his departure arrived. With his bag packed, Elias took one last look around his apartment. He knew he was only leaving for a long weekend, but he said, "See you soon." Anyway, on the train to the airport, he admired the green landscapes on the edge of the city. The sun was shining. He felt a quiet excitement swirling in his chest. While the trip was for work, he would have the whole weekend to explore Rome. It had been so long since he had an adventure like this, and a journey to his mother's homeland was waking up a part of him he had forgotten. The flight was only a few hours. As the plane moved through the clouds, Elias looked down at the world below. "It's incredible," he thought, "that we can fly." When he was a boy, he often dreamed he could grow wings and soar over fields and oceans. He laughed softly to himself. "Well," he thought, "this is close enough." The plane landed by afternoon, and Elias made his way to a small guest house in the heart of the city, not far from the ancient ruins. His room was simple and beautiful, with a mix of old and new. He took a deep breath and let out a long sigh, feeling a wave of peace wash over him. The room had a small balcony. He walked out and looked at the ancient city buzzing with life below. He was ready to explore. Elias wandered through narrow streets and wide squares, through markets and along quiet tree-lined roads. He had no map and felt wonderfully lost, with no worries at all. He simply let the city reveal itself to him, one step at a time. He climbed a set of old stairs and found himself at the foot of a great ancient structure. Looking up at the stone walls, he felt for a moment as if he had stepped back in time. He remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell him, stories that felt as magical as this place did now. As he walked through the ruins, he felt a deep emotion rise within him, and for a moment he thought he might cry. He realized it had been years since he had allowed himself to be moved by anything. This trip was beginning to reveal a new version of himself, one that felt more peaceful, confident, and clear. He spent the whole weekend simply being. He enjoyed the local food, breathed in the history, and slept soundly for as long as his body wanted. All his worries melted away as he gave himself permission to be fully present in this land whose history was a part of him. On Monday morning, he went to the startup's office and met the team. The meeting went well, but his heart was elsewhere. That final evening, he sat on his balcony, looking out at the city. The air was warm, The sky was clear, and the moon shone brightly. He felt a familiar connection to the night sky. He remembered family trips to the coast when he was young. On some warm nights, his father would make hot chocolate, and the whole family would sit under the stars, sipping from their mugs. A wave of nostalgia washed over him, a longing for simpler days when he felt more connected to the natural world. Looking at the moon now, he felt a deep sense of comfort, as if it were singing him a lullaby. He went to bed and fell into a swift sound sleep. Back home, over the next few days, Elias felt a strong longing for something, though he didn't know what. He knew it was connected to his trip. He missed the feeling of adventure. It was as if a part of him had woken up. A voice inside was growing louder, and it frightened him. He wondered if it would have been easier never to have gone, but the whispers became clearer and more confident until they formed a single message: return to what matters. It whispered, return to what matters. Though he was scared, he knew he had to listen. He knew, with a certainty that shook him, that he had to leave his job and return to the place that had inspired him. He was not a risk-taker, but he knew he had to take this leap. His future self was depending on it. By the end of the week, he had resigned. His sister offered to stay in his apartment while he went back to the land of his ancestors. Unsure of where to go, he closed his eyes and pointed to a map. His finger landed on a small, remote island. A few days later, he arrived. He found a small guest house in a tiny village high in the mountains. The owners, an older couple named Sophia and Marco, welcomed him warmly. He felt, without fully understanding why, that he was in the right place. The next day, he walked into the hills with no plan. He felt completely free, perhaps for the first time since he was a child. That night, he dreamed he was floating in space, looking down at the earth. He saw it as a beautiful small home, and he felt a deep sense of wonder and love for it. He woke up feeling that clarity. He started spending his days walking and connecting with the land. He helped Sophia and Marco in their garden and kitchen. He learned to cook with local herbs and vegetables. His hands remembered the joyful work of preparing food. One night, he had a vivid dream. He was serving a beautiful feast to his friends and family under a twilight sky. He woke up knowing exactly what he was meant to do. The message return to what matters became clear. It meant returning to the earth, to food, to nourishing people and the land. He stayed for many more months, learning everything he could. When he finally returned home, he knew his path. He enrolled in a culinary program and started his own small business, focusing on meals that were good for both people and the planet. On the night after his first successful event, a dinner under the stars, he dreamed he was on a beach on that faraway island, listening to the waves, feeling connected to everything. He felt a peace that had stayed with him since his journey began. For the rest of his life, Elias looked back and was thankful for that first trip, for the unknown road that led him back to himself. And each day he felt grateful for the detour that changed everything. Of course. Here is the continuation of the story, keeping it original and optimized for a calm, soothing delivery. Years gently unfolded for Elias. His small catering company, which he named Terra Nourish, did not just grow, it blossomed. It started with intimate gatherings in friends' gardens, and grew to larger events in sunlit clearings and under wide, starry skies. His mission remained simple: to create beautiful, plant-based food that honored the earth and connected people to the simple, profound joy of a shared meal. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling event, a wedding held in an apple orchard, Elias sat in his quiet kitchen. The silence was comfortable, filled with the lingering scent of rosemary and baked earth. He felt a deep contentment, but also a familiar, gentle tug in his heart. It was the same feeling he had felt all those years ago before his trip to Rome. It wasn't a feeling of restlessness, but of a circle waiting to be completed. He thought of Sophia and Marco on the island, of their kindness and the wisdom they had so freely shared. He thought of the mountain paths and the secluded beach. An idea, which had been a quiet seed for a long time, began to sprout. The next morning he called his sister. "I'm thinking of going back," he said, "just for a little while." Her response was immediate and warm. "Of course you are. It's time." This time his journey was different. There was no anxiety, only a sweet anticipation. He packed lightly, but in his suitcase he carried packets of seeds from his own garden, heirloom tomatoes, fragrant basil, and a particular type of bean his grandfather had loved. When he arrived on the island, the familiar scent of pine and sea air wrapped around him like a welcome. He made his way up the winding mountain road to the village. As he approached the guest house, he saw Marco tending to the geraniums, his back a little more bent, but his smile just as bright. "Elias," Marco called out, his voice full of genuine joy. Sophia emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and her eyes crinkled into a warm, knowing smile. It was as if he had never left. He settled into the same simple room with the same breathtaking view. This time, however, he was not a lost wanderer, but a returning friend. The next day, he walked to his favorite spot, the cave overlooking the sea. He watched the sun rise, painting the water in hues of gold and pink. He had come here years ago feeling found. Now he returned feeling full, over a dinner of fresh salad and crusty bread. Elias shared his idea with Sophia and Marco. "You taught me how to listen to the land," he said. "You showed me that food is a language of care. I would be honored to cook a meal, a proper feast, for the village. A thank you from my heart to yours." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. She simply reached over and patted his hand. The following week was a whirlwind of happy preparation. Elias worked with local farmers and vendors. He and Marco foraged for wild greens and herbs. The kitchen became a hub of laughter and chopping, of simmering pots and the warm, yeasty smell of rising dough. It felt like his dream of the feast had come to life, but this time he was wide awake. The day of the feast, long tables were set up under a large, white canopy in the village square, overlooking the sea. As the sun began to set, casting a soft, golden light, the villagers began to arrive. There was music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Elias and a team of helpers brought out the food, platters of roasted vegetables glistening with herbs, delicate pastries stuffed with wild greens and local cheese, rich dips sprinkled with paprika and olive oil, and loaves of bread still warm from the oven. It was a celebration of the island itself, served on a plate. As Elias looked at the faces around the table, Sophia and Marco, The farmers, the fishermen, the families, he felt a profound sense of belonging. He was not just connected to the land, but to the people who loved it. He had not only returned to what mattered, he had multiplied it. That night, as he lay in his bed, the sounds of the distant sea drifting through his window, he felt a peace deeper than any sleep. His journey had not been about finding one place to call home, but about learning that home is wherever you cultivate love, connection, and a good meal to share. And he knew with absolute certainty that this would not be his last visit. The circle was now complete, and yet it was always expanding, just like the universe he had once dreamed of, forever welcoming him back. Of course, here is a further continuation, delving deeper into the peaceful and reflective aftermath of Elias's journey. The morning after the feast, the village square was quiet, holding only the gentle memory of laughter and music. Elias woke not with the energy of a new plan, but with the soft, settled feeling of a task beautifully completed. He helped Sophia and Marco clean the square, the three of them working in comfortable silence, the shared effort feeling like a final loving note to the symphony of the previous evening. In the days that followed, Elias settled into a new, slower rhythm. He was no longer a student, eager to learn everything at once, nor a visitor on a strict timeline. He was simply Elias present. He would wake with the sun and walk the same mountain paths, but now he noticed even more the way a certain wild thyme grew only on the south-facing slope, the particular lizard that sunned itself on the same warm rock every afternoon. His connection to the land had deepened from wonder to a quiet, familiar friendship. He began a small project with Marco, restoring a neglected corner of the garden into a proper herb spiral. They gathered stones from the property, and Elias showed Marco the design, explaining how the different levels would create microclimates for sun-loving and shade-preferring herbs. It was a small thing, but it felt significant, a way to give back a piece of the knowledge he had gained, to leave a lasting mark on the soil that had given him so much. One afternoon, as he was trimming the rosemary for the spiral, Sophia brought him a glass of cold lemonade and sat on a nearby bench. "You are different this time, Elias," she said, not as a question, but as a simple observation. "The first time you were searching, now you are just being." Elias smiled, wiping the earth from his hands. "I think I'm finally learning how to just be," he replied. "It's the hardest and easiest thing I've ever done." His time to leave was approaching again, but the sadness he expected didn't come. Instead, there was a gentle certainty. He had proven that this place was a part of him, and he could return to it whenever he needed. The island wasn't an escape. It was a refuge, a touchstone. On his last evening, he walked down to the secluded beach one final time. The sand was cool beneath his feet, and the sea was a vast, breathing expanse of indigo and silver under the twilight sky. He didn't feel the dramatic pull of his first visit, nor the triumphant closure of the feast. He felt a profound and simple gratitude. He thought of his life back home, his thriving business, his family, his friends. He realized that the true journey hadn't been about choosing one home over the other, but about weaving the two together. The peace of the island could be carried in his heart into the busy city, and the purpose he found in his work could be shared with the island in return. He was a bridge between two worlds, and both were richer for it. As a final gesture, he gathered a handful of smooth, sun-bleached stones from the beach and placed them in his pocket. They were not souvenirs, but anchors, tangible pieces of this peace to hold in his hand when the world became too loud. The flight home was smooth. Looking down from the airplane window, he no longer saw a distant, magical world, but a beautiful, connected part of the whole. He was returning not as a changed man, but as a more complete version of himself. Weeks later, back in his own kitchen, preparing for a bustling corporate event, he felt a moment of stress. The orders were complex, the timing was tight. He paused, closed his eyes, and reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the cool, smooth surface of one of the stones from the island. Instantly, he was transported. He felt the warmth of the sun on his skin, heard the gentle crash of the waves, smelled the wild herbs on the mountain air. His breathing slowed. The stress did not vanish, but it lost its power over him. He was in that moment both here and there, fully present in his work, yet eternally connected to the source of his peace. He finished the preparations with a calm, focused grace. The event was a success, but the greatest triumph was one no one saw: the quiet smile on Elias's face as he cleaned his station. A man who had truly found his way, not just on a map, but within the vast and welcoming landscape of his own soul. And so, his life continued, a beautiful, ever-unfolding blend of purpose and peace, each nourishing the other, forever, of course. Here is a continuation that explores the next gentle phase of Elias's life, focusing on the themes of legacy and enduring peace. The passing of time was no longer marked by the frantic ticking of a clock, but by the gentle, reliable cycles of growth and harvest. Elias's hair began to show traces of silver, much like the first frost on the garden herbs. His business, Terra Nourish, had become an institution, not through aggressive expansion, but through a reputation for profound, soulful quality. He now mentored young chefs, not just in the techniques of cooking, but in the philosophy he had learned on the island, that the most important ingredient is intention. His trips to the island became the central pillars of his year. He was no longer a visitor, but a steward. He and Marco, whose steps had grown slower but whose spirit remained bright, would sit for hours planning the seasonal plantings. Sophia's hands, now often resting in her lap, would still guide him as he prepared the old family recipes, her sharp eyes catching every detail. One spring, Elias arrived to find a new, unspoken understanding in their welcome. It was in the way Marco simply handed him the keys to the old tool shed, and the way Sophia gestured to the ledgers of the guest house, now left open on the kitchen table for him to see. They were not asking him to take over. They were showing him that he was already a part of the fabric of the place. It was during this visit that the idea came to him, not as a sudden inspiration, but as a quiet, inevitable knowing. He was walking through the olive grove, the ancient, gnarled trees standing as silent witnesses to centuries, when he saw it, a small, unused stone structure, half hidden by ivy. That had once been a shepherd's shelter. It had a solid roof and a breathtaking view of the sea. He spent the rest of his stay clearing the space, not with hurry, but with reverence. He didn't tell Sophia and Marco his plan, but he saw the quiet approval in their eyes as they watched him work. On his return to the city, he began the process of gently shifting his role in Terra Nourish, promoting his most gifted protégé to head chef. He was not retiring. He was making space. A year later, he returned to the island with a single large suitcase and a heart full of calm purpose. He went straight to the stone shelter. With the blessing of Sophia and Marco, and with the help of a local craftsman, he transformed it. They installed a large, simple window that framed the sea like a living painting, a small, efficient wood-fired oven, and a long, handmade wooden table. He called it the hearth. It was not a restaurant. It was a sanctuary. Once a month, he would invite a small group of guests from the guest house, or sometimes travelers like Anya, who seemed to need it most, for a single, long, slow meal. There was no menu. He would cook what the garden and the sea offered that day. The conversation would ebb and flow like the tide outside the window. He asked for no payment. Instead, he asked that they help him with a single task: plant a tree, repair a dry stone wall, preserve a batch of tomatoes for the winter. It was an economy of care, not currency. One evening, as he was serving a soup made with the first squash of the season to a quiet family from the city, he caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw an older man, his face lined not with worry, but with sun and smiles. He saw the young, anxious commuter from long ago, and he sent that young man a wave of gratitude. The journey had been long, and every step had been necessary. Later that night, sitting with Sophia and Marco under a canopy of brilliant stars, a profound sense of completion settled over him. He had built a successful life, but more importantly, he had woven himself into a timeless tapestry. He had taken the gifts he was given and had passed them on, quietly and without fanfare. The story of Elias was no longer just about a man who found peace. It was about a man who became a source of it, a steady, gentle flame in the hearth of the world, warming all who were lucky enough to find their way to his door. And in the quiet, starlit silence, that was more than enough. It was everything.
Arthur Pym lived in the quiet, dust-moted hush of the Everwood Archive, a private library and repository for forgotten things. He was a man of routine and silence, comfortable amidst the shelves of leather-bound books and boxes of unlabeled photographs. But Arthur held a secret. He was a resonant. When he held an old object with strong emotional history, he didn't see visions, he heard them. A wedding ring might yield a faint chorus of laughter and vows. A soldier's dog tag might carry a ghostly echo of distant gunfire and whispered prayers. It was a gift he kept hidden, a burden that made the past a noisy, often overwhelming place. One Tuesday, a new collection arrived from the estate of a woman named Ilara Vane. Among the usual detritus of a life was a small sea-green journal, its lock rusted shut. The moment Arthur touched the worn cover, a single clear sound washed over him, the gentle, persistent crash of ocean waves on a rocky shore, and beneath it, the faint, hopeful melody of a jazz trumpet. Intrigued, he carefully pried the lock open. The diary belonged to a young woman named Cora, writing in 1925. It was not a chronicle of her daily life, but a love letter to a man named Julian, a traveling musician she met one summer. The entries were poetic and urgent, filled with stolen moments by the sea, promises made under the stars, and the haunting sound of his trumpet echoing across the cliffs. The final entry was a plea. He leaves tomorrow on the midnight train. He says he'll send for me when he reaches Westcliff and finds us a home. He played our song one last time. I have to believe him. I will wait. The resonance within the diary was powerful, a symphony of yearning and unfinished love. Arthur felt a profound sense of duty. He had to find out what happened. Did Julian send for her? Did Cora wait in vain? The diary's memory was a story without an ending, and it had chosen Arthur to find its final note. Part 2. The Journey to Westcliff. Using clues from the diary, the name of Julian's band, the Westcliff Ramblers, and mentions of a Grand Vista hotel, Arthur embarks on a journey, a terrifying break from his own routine. He travels by train, watching the dense cityscape give way to rolling hills and eventually to the dramatic, wind-swept coastline. He arrives in the town of Westcliff, a town that seems suspended in time. His first stop is the local historical society, where he meets an elderly volunteer named Eleanor. She remembers the Ramblers. Oh, they were the talk of the town, she says, her eyes twinkling. Julian Hayes, he had a smile that could charm the birds from the trees. He and Cora were inseparable that summer. But her face falls. He left, just like the diary says. But he never settled here. The band broke up. Last I heard, he stayed in a little coastal town further north called Seabrook. He became a lighthouse keeper. The trail leads north. In Seabrook, Arthur finds a community of fishermen and artists. The lighthouse is now automated, but the old keeper's cottage is still there, occupied by a reclusive painter. Arthur approaches, holding the diary. He explains his mission, not his gift. The painter, a quiet woman named Maeve, listens intently. "You're looking for Julian's story?" she says. "He lived here for 40 years, alone. He was a quiet man, always watching the sea. He'd play his trumpet sometimes at night, just for the gulls and the stars." She points to a small, overgrown plot of land behind the cottage. "He's buried there. He left instructions to be buried facing the ocean." Arthur goes to the simple, weather-beaten stone. It reads, "Julian Hayes. His music was for one, but his silence was for all." As Arthur places a hand on the cool granite, a powerful resonance flows through him. It is not the crashing waves of the diary, but a deep, profound, and peaceful silence, a lifetime of waiting, of loving a memory, of a promise kept in the heart, if not in life. Julian had never stopped loving Cora. He had simply been too poor, too lost, to ever feel he could send for her, and his pride became his prison. Part 3. The Final Note and the Unfinished Symphony. Arthur's quest seems complete, but the story feels unresolved. He returns to Eleanor in Westcliff, dejected. He tells her what he found. Eleanor is quiet for a long time. "You know," she says softly, "Cora never married. She lived in that big house on Elm Street until she passed just a few months ago. That was her estate you sorted through." Arthur is stunned. He had been searching for a ghost. Eleanor leads him to a back room of the Historical Society. "She was a dear friend," she says, Before she lost her sight, she was a wonderful painter. She left this for the society. It is a large, beautiful painting of the West Cliff coastline. In the foreground, a young couple sits on a blanket. In the background, almost hidden in the dusk, a man plays a trumpet. "But that's not all," Eleanor says, handing Arthur a small, flat box. "She said that if anyone ever came asking about Julian, I was to give them this." Inside the box is a pristine shellac 78 RPM record. The handwritten label reads, "For Cora, our song, J." It is the only recording Julian ever made. Arthur finds an antique gramophone. He places the needle on the record. A crackle fills the air, and then, clear and pure, a trumpet begins to play. It's the same melody he heard in the diary's resonance, a sweet, lonely, hopeful tune. As the last note fades, Arthur doesn't hear a resonance of the past. He feels a profound sense of closure, of a circle finally being completed after a century. He returns to the Everwood archive, a changed man. The world is no longer a repository of silent, dusty things, but a library of living stories. He begins to tentatively use his gift not as a burden, but as a service, gently helping people connect with the echoes of their own pasts. He even starts a small project of his own, writing down the stories he hears, giving them a voice, becoming the keeper he was always meant to be. The story ends with Arthur holding a new, unmarked object, not with dread, but with a quiet smile, ready to listen to the next story waiting to be told. Leaving the Everwood archive felt like shedding a second skin. For Arthur Pym, the world beyond his dust-caked windows was a cacophony of raw, unfiltered resonance. The train station was a tempest of shouted goodbyes, the screech of brakes, and the low, anxious hum of 1,000 overlapping conversations. He clutched his small suitcase, inside which, wrapped in soft felt, lay Cora's sea-green diary. It was his compass, its gentle oceanic whisper, a stabilizing force in the sensory storm. He found a seat in a nearly empty carriage and watched the city unravel. The soot-stained brick buildings gave way to long, flat fields, where the only sound was the wind combing through the grass. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. The diary's memory, the crash of waves, the hopeful trumpet, was a constant, quiet melody beneath the train's rhythmic clatter. For the first time, his gift felt less like a curse and more like a purpose. He was not just an archivist of objects, but a curator of unfinished lives. Westcliff, when he arrived, was a town painted in watercolor hues. The salt-tinged air was a crisp, clean shock to his system. The buildings were low and weathered, their wood siding bleached by sun and sea. The primary sound was the relentless.
The old keeper's cottage, a stone-built structure with a stubborn, sturdy look, had a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. Arthur approached, his pulse quickening. A woman answered his knock, her hands stained with paint, her gaze sharp and intelligent. This was Maeve. He told his story again, holding out the diary like a talisman. He spoke of Cora, of Julian, of a promise made a lifetime ago. Maeve listened, her expression unreadable. She finally gestured for him to enter. The cottage was a single open room, filled with canvases, seascapes of breathtaking, turbulent beauty. "You've come a long way for a ghost story," she said, her voice low and calm. Julian Hayes lived here for 40 years. He took over as head keeper when the old man retired. He was a man of few words. People thought him strange, but he was kind. She led him to a small, windswept plot of land behind the cottage, overlooking the churning water below. A simple, rough-hewn granite stone stood there, almost swallowed by beach grass. Julian Hayes, the inscription read. His music was for one, but his silence was for all. Arthur felt a profound weight of sorrow. He'd found the end of the line. He knelt and, almost without thinking, placed his palm flat on the cool, sun-warmed stone. The resonance that flowed into him was unlike any he had ever experienced. It was not a chaotic symphony of sound, but a single, powerful, sustained note. It was the sound of deep, abiding love, not as a passionate fire, but as a constant, steady flame that had burned for decades. It was the sound of regret, yes, but also of a fierce, protective devotion. It was the sound of a man who had chosen a life of solitude, forever bound to the place where he had been happiest, forever playing his song for the one woman he believed he had failed. It was, ultimately, the sound of a promise kept in the only way he knew how, through a lifetime of unwavering, silent fidelity. There was no tragedy in this resonance, only a deep, peaceful, and heartbreakingly beautiful silence. Julian had never stopped loving Cora. He had simply built a monument to her in his heart, and this lighthouse was its physical form. Arthur stood up, tears drying on the sea wind. He had found Julian's ending. But Cora's story still hung in the air, unfinished. The symphony was not complete. Returning to Westcliff felt like stepping back into the first act of a play whose final scene he had already witnessed. The town's gentle bustle now seemed poignant, full of lives whose quiet conclusions he could only guess at. He went straight back to the Historical Society, needing to tell Eleanor what he had found. Eleanor was at her usual post. She took one look at Arthur's face and knew. "You found him," she stated softly. Arthur nodded, the profound silence of Julian's grave still echoing within him. He told her about Seabrook, about Maeve, about the lighthouse and the simple headstone. "He never stopped loving her," Arthur finished, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "He just couldn't find his way back." Eleanor listened, her work-worn hands folded in her lap. A long, quiet moment passed. "I think," she said finally, "it's time you knew the rest of it." She rose slowly and beckoned him to follow her to a back room, a small gallery of local art and artifacts. She stopped before a large, beautifully rendered oil painting. It was the Westcliff coastline at twilight, the sky a cascade of violet and gold. In the foreground, a young couple sat on a picnic blanket, their faces turned toward the sunset. The woman had Cora's soft, hopeful features from the one photograph Arthur had seen. The man had his arm around her. But it was the background that made Arthur catch his breath. Almost hidden in the gathering dusk, leaning against a gnarled pine tree, was the faint but unmistakable figure of a man holding a trumpet. "This Cora painted," Eleanor said quietly. "She was a wonderful artist before her eyes failed her. She gave this to the society years ago. She never stopped loving him either, you see. She never married. She lived in her family home, living a quiet life, surrounded by her memories and her art." Arthur stared at the painting, his mind reeling. Two lives, running parallel to each other, separated by only a few dozen miles of coastline, yet living a lifetime apart, bound by the same memory. "But that is not the end of the story, Arthur," Eleanor said. She walked to a locked cabinet and retrieved a small, flat cardboard box. "Cora was my friend. A few weeks before she passed, she was sorting through her things. She gave me this. She said, 'Eleanor, my story with Julian is mine. But his music shouldn't die with me. If anyone ever comes asking about him, someone who truly cares to know, you give them this.'" With trembling hands, Arthur took the box. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was a pristine shellac 78 RPM record. The handwritten label in a faded but elegant script read, "For Cora, our song, J." His breath hitched. The melody from the diary, the tune Julian played from the cliffs for decades, it was here, captured in shellac. Eleanor led him to an old crank-handled gramophone in the corner of the room. With a reverence usually reserved for holy rites, Arthur placed the record on the turntable. He wound the crank, the mechanism clicking softly in the hushed room. He carefully lowered the needle. A storm of surface crackle erupted, the sound of time itself. And then, from the heart of that storm, a sound emerged, clear, pure, and brimming with a youthful, aching hope. It was Julian's trumpet. The melody was exactly as Arthur had heard it in the diary's resonance, sweet, lonely, and full of boundless, optimistic love. It was a love song, simple and direct, untouched by the regret and solitude that would later shade his life. This was the promise, frozen in time. As the last note faded into the final crackle, Arthur expected a powerful resonance to overwhelm him, but none came. Instead, he felt a profound and utter stillness. The loop was closed. The memory was played, not just in his mind, but in the real world. The story was complete. The silence that followed was not the silence of absence, but of peace. He returned to the Everwood archive a different man. The dust motes still danced in the sunbeams, but they now seemed like glittering possibilities. He did not return to his old fearful habits. Instead, he began a new project. In a fresh, clean ledger, he began to write. He wrote the story of Cora and Julian not as a tragic romance, but as a testament to the enduring power of love, however fractured its expression. He wrote it from the memories he had heard, from the places he had seen, from the final note on a shellac disc. He began to tentatively offer his gift to others. A woman brought in her mother's locket. Arthur held it, heard a lullaby, and the woman wept with joyful memory. A man brought an old dented pocket watch. Arthur heard the bustling sounds of a long-closed family store, and the man smiled, remembering his grandfather. Arthur Pym was no longer just the keeper of silent memories. He had become their translator, their scribe. He learned to control the flow, to listen with intention, to find the story within the noise. The world was no longer a threatening cacophony, but a vast, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating library of lived experience. The story ends one afternoon, much like it began. A new object arrives at the archive, a small, carved wooden bird. The donor knows nothing about it. Arthur picks it up. He closes his eyes, ready to listen. A faint sound reaches him, the laughter of a child and the distant rhythmic chop of a woodcarver's tool. A small, simple story waiting to be heard. Arthur picks up his pen, a quiet smile on his face, and opens his ledger to a fresh, blank page. Months bled into a year. The story of Cora and Julian, meticulously written in Arthur's new ledger, became a secret touchstone for him. His work at the Everwood archive transformed. Where he once saw clutter, he now saw potential. He began a personal project, the Catalog of Echoes. For each item he processed, he would not only log its physical description, but if it held a strong resonance,
This encounter led to another. Petrov, in his youth, had known of others with sensitive ears. He spoke of a whispering network, people who could feel the history in stone or hear the stories in old wood. He gave Arthur a name, Elora, a woman who ran an antique shop called The Chronology of Things. Arthur found her shop tucked away in a cobblestoned lane. Elora was a woman of indeterminate age, with calm, knowing eyes. When Arthur, emboldened by his journey, haltingly tried to explain his sensitivity, she simply smiled and finished his sentence. She was a resident too. Her shop was a sanctuary. She introduced him to a small, scattered community, a stonemason who could hear the prayers whispered in cathedral walls, a librarian who could taste the emotions left in the pages of books, a quiet gardener who understood the language of plants. For the first time, Arthur was not alone. He had found his tribe. The Society of Resonance was not a formal club, but a loose-knit circle of people who understood the burden and the beauty of their gift. They taught him techniques to control the influx, to raise and lower his inner volume, and, most importantly, to let go of the echoes he did not need to carry. He was learning not just to hear the past, but to curate it. Elora came to Arthur with a request. A dear friend of hers, an elderly woman named Mrs. Higgins, was being troubled in her centuries-old cottage. She heard whispers in the walls at night, not ghostly, malevolent whispers, but the sound of a child endlessly crying. Her family thought she was descending into dementia and wanted to move her to a facility. The society was sometimes called upon for such things, not exorcisms, but clarifications. Arthur, now seen as having a particular talent for auditory resonance, was asked to help. He spent a night in the cottage's smallest bedroom, the source of the sounds. As dusk fell, he heard it, a faint, desperate sobbing, the sound of a small body shaking a locked doorknob, and a heartbroken whisper, "Let me out! Please, let me out!" The resonance was potent and trapped, a moment of pure childhood terror echoing through the decades. Using the techniques Elora had taught him, he didn't just listen, he sought the source. The resonance was strongest near the room's old fireplace. Investigating, he found a loose brick. Behind it was a small, hidden space, a priest hole from a much earlier era. And inside, not a skeleton, but a small, crudely carved wooden horse. The moment he lifted the toy, the crying ceased. The memory held within was not of a tragedy, but of a resolution. He heard the scrape of the brick being moved, a young boy's gasp of joy, and a woman's soothing voice saying, "There you are, you silly boy, you found your horse. You're not trapped. You were always safe." The haunting was not the trauma of being locked in, but the powerful residual emotion of the moment of rescue and relief. Arthur presented the wooden horse to Mrs. Higgins. The moment she held it, a peaceful smile graced her face. "My grandfather. He talked about this. He hid in here during a game and fell asleep. They searched for hours." The whispers stopped. The memory, once confronted and understood, had been laid to rest. Arthur had not just solved a mystery, he had healed a home. His success with the cottage led to a larger, more abstract challenge. The city council, through a contact of Elora's, approached the society informally. They were restoring the city's grand old central train station, and the lead architect wanted to capture the soul of the building in a new art installation. Could the resonance help? Arthur was tasked with listening to the station's heart. For a week, he immersed himself in the vast, echoing space.
He didn't just hear the present-day crowds and announcements. He layered the resonances, using his gift like a master sound engineer. He heard the steam-powered hisses and triumphant whistles of the first trains, the joyful chaos of reunions after the Great War, the tearful goodbyes of soldiers leaving for the front, the determined stepfoots of immigrants arriving with nothing but hope, the low, desperate murmurs of the homeless seeking shelter during the Great Depression, the shared, silent awe of thousands watching a royal procession on a black-and-white television screen hung for the occasion. It was not one story, but a million. It was the symphony of the city itself. He couldn't transcribe it all, but he could distill its essence. He presented his findings to the architect not as a list of sounds, but as a narrative of emotions: hope, loss, joy, anticipation, farewell, welcome. The resulting installation, the Echo Concourse, was a masterpiece. Subtle, directional speakers were embedded in the architecture, playing a soft, ever-changing soundscape composed from Arthur's notes. A ghostly train whistle here, a ripple of distant applause there, the faint sound of a big band tune from a long-gated newsstand. It was a resonance made physical, a gift to the city that allowed everyone, resonant or not, to feel the weight and wonder of its own history. Arthur had become a composer of memory. With his growing mastery, Arthur's confidence sometimes bordered on hubris. A young historian brought him an artifact that tested him to his limit: a waterlogged, salt-crusted pocket watch recovered from a shipwreck in the North Sea. The historian wanted to know the final moments of the ship, the SS Peregrine. Arthur, without a second thought, held the watch. The resonance that hit him was catastrophic. It was not a memory, but a raw, sensory overload of a tragedy. Icy, black water, the deafening roar of a storm, the terrifying screech of tearing metal, the screams, hundreds of them, merging into a single horrifying chorus of pure terror. And then, one by one, they were snuffed out, until only the crushing silence of the deep remained. It was too much. The volume was turned to maximum, and he couldn't shut it off. The horror flooded his mind, drowning out all other thought. He dropped the watch, but the sounds remained, playing on a loop inside his skull. He fell into a profound state of shock, a psychic trauma that left him catatonic for days. Ilara and the society found him. They cared for him, using their combined abilities not to add more sound, but to create a buffer of calm, peaceful resonances around him. The sound of a gentle stream from a stone, the quiet hum of a spinning wheel from an old distaff. It was a battle of echoes fought in the landscape of his mind. Slowly, painfully, Arthur surfaced. He had learned a terrible, vital lesson. His gift was not a toy. Some memories were not meant to be heard. Some silences were not peaceful, but absolute. He had gazed into the abyss, and it had gazed back. He emerged humbler, wiser, and with a deep, newfound respect for the darkness that could linger in the past. The experience with the pocket watch left a scar. Arthur became more cautious, more selective. He realized he had been so focused on the past that he was neglecting his own present. He thought of Cora and Julian, whose lives became a monument to a single memory, and he feared becoming like them, a curator of other people's lives, while his own remained an empty archive. He decided to start creating his own resonances. He began to live more intentionally. He invited a few members of the society for dinner, filling his quiet apartment with laughter and conversation, layering new, joyful sounds onto the very crockery and furniture. He started learning to play the piano, filling the air with clumsy but heartfelt scales, a sound entirely of his own making. He even tentatively began dating a warm-hearted bookbinder named Clara, who knew nothing of his gift and loved him for his quiet kindness and the way he truly listened. He continued his work at the archive and his quiet missions with the society, but the balance had shifted. He was no longer just a keeper of silent memories. He was an active participant in the humming, vibrant, messy symphony of the present. He was writing his own ledger now, not with ink, but with lived experience. His reputation, carefully guarded within a small circle, nonetheless grew. One day, a teenage girl was brought to the Everwood archive by her desperate parents. Maya was on the verge of being hospitalized,